In the summer of 2018, a convoy of trucks and pack crews moved millions of microscopic fingerlings into the barren Alpine heights of northern British Columbia, hauling live cargo into glacial headwaters where no fish had ever swum. 5 years later, an outcome unfolded that caught biologists, planners, and economists off guard. Tributaries barren for centuries transformed into premier angling destinations, while remote settlements hollowed out by shuttered timber mills generated revenues outpacing established regional centers in the valleys. Yet introducing non-native aquatic life into high-elevation watersheds brought far more than fly rods and tourism dollars into the backcountry. Across forestry camps, ministry offices, and community halls, people remained divided on whether this was visionary regional development or an expensive ecological gamble. My name is Ambrose Wild, and what happened on that subalpine plateau is far stranger than anyone expected. On paper, the proposal looked like a bureaucratic fantasy. Provincial fisheries authorities, seeking to diversify an economy crushed by forestry downturns, greenlit a project to distribute millions of juvenile trout across thousands of alpine tarns and glacial headwaters. These were not accessible park recreation sites. They were isolated waters suspended between 2,000 and 3,000 meters above sea level on Crown land, where logging roads ended 20 kilometers short of the shoreline. The logistical dilemma was simple. To transport living fingerlings to an isolated cirque without roads, you had to haul them on your back. Trucks carried aerated tanks as far as washed-out access trails permitted. From the gravel's edge, local crews strapped custom 40-liter oxygen-fed pack tanks to their shoulders and climbed on foot. Some tarns demanded a grueling 12-hour bushwhack across talus slopes, slide paths, and dense scrub. Every fingerling had to arrive alive, each barely the length of a pocket knife, while the clock ticked against finite reserves of compressed oxygen. Predictably, almost everyone familiar with the severe climate dismissed the endeavor as a waste of public money. These were not temperate maritime rivers. Glacial runoff kept water barely above freezing, cold enough to induce severe hypothermia in minutes, and the granite basins appeared devoid of biomass. Outpost residents who had spent decades guiding, hunting, and trapping put it bluntly: nothing thrives in that frozen shale, and stocked fingerlings would simply starve or freeze within their first season. The $8 million price tag intensified controversy. It equaled the entire annual infrastructure maintenance budget for several rural districts. In the legislature, critics asked why taxpayers were underwriting an untested fish stocking scheme, while regional highways needed resurfacing, rural health clinics faced shortages, and timber towns fought for survival. In response, regional development officers presented an economic map of the interior, charting distress. Forestry hamlets where household incomes had collapsed after mill closures, and where graduating students boarded buses for Prince George, Kelowna, or Vancouver. The Alpine peaks provided a spectacular backdrop, but as trappers remarked, you cannot eat mountain scenery. The enterprise was championed by a senior fisheries biologist who had studied how high-altitude waters in Scandinavia were engineered into lucrative sport fisheries. His core hypothesis formed the central pivot. Subalpine hydrology was pristine, water clarity flawless, and temperatures consistently cold. The habitat was not barren because it lacked carrying capacity. Massive post-glacial waterfalls and granite canyons downstream had physically blocked wild fish from migrating into the upper plateau after the last ice age. The ecosystem possessed everything necessary to sustain life. The only missing component was the fish. The first subarctic winter seemed to prove skeptics right. When technicians hiked into the cirques the following spring, surveys showed only 30% of the fingerlings had survived. Shallow tarns froze solid to bedrock, while in deeper basins, thick ice and snow depleted dissolved oxygen, suffocating schools. Yet the 30% that survived defied every biological model. Within 12 months, monitoring crews recorded healthy yearlings weighing over half a kilogram. By the close of the second season, individual specimens tipped scales at over a full kilogram. In alpine waters with no visible plant life, where standard models dictated fish should be stunted, they grew faster than in rich southern hatcheries. The explanation lay in cold water limnology. Glacial meltwater, holding temperatures just above 0 degrees Celsius, carries exceptionally high concentrations of dissolved oxygen. Under these hyperoxygenated conditions, cold-adapted salmonids convert food into muscle tissue with astonishing metabolic efficiency. While granite basins appeared sterile, snowmelt rills carried a continuous, invisible drift of benthic invertebrates, midges, and tiny cold-water crustaceans, the precise high-protein nutrition fingerlings evolved to exploit. Combined with an absence of native predators, 0 competing species, and a virgin food web, the stock underwent an explosive surge. The biologist's theory was proven. Barren alpine waters were an unexploited ecological engine. By the third summer, the first wave of backcountry anglers arrived, numbering roughly 200 over the season. Longtime residents watched with disbelief as visitors paid thousands for floatplane charters and spent 8 hours on decommissioned Forest Service roads just to cast flies for trout they could buy at a supermarket for $20. 2 seasons later, that trickle surged into an influx of over 8,000 visitors. In one former logging outpost that had scraped by on firewood sales and guiding, the community brought in more revenue from anglers in a single summer than the local economy had generated over the previous 5 years combined. Recognizing the economic momentum, the provincial ministry deployed Phase 2, decentralizing production by establishing small-scale, high-elevation hatcheries directly within alpine valleys. The infrastructure was basic: concrete raceways, mountain spring water, and standard feed pellets, avoiding complex filtration computers. Former forestry workers mastered operational procedures within 2 weeks. Over a dozen satellite hatcheries were soon producing roughly 20 million fingerlings each year, 10 times the original pilot stock. Fish were hatched and acclimatized directly in northern alpine air. Routine stocking runs evolved into steady seasonal work, where local pack crews earned fixed contracts for every healthy batch delivered into high tarns. Just as the fishery gained traction, an extraordinary winter nearly destroyed it. An Arctic polar vortex plunged temperatures to -38 degrees Celsius, 10 degrees colder than the 30-year average, while early snowfall buried plateaus. Shallow tarns froze solid, destroying everything beneath. Out of 72 monitored study lakes, 20 suffered absolute winter kill. The lead biologist later admitted this cold snap was the first time he genuinely believed the experiment had failed. Yet during those frozen months, an unscripted development occurred. Local residents took survival of the fishery into their own hands. In one valley, volunteer crews hauled chainsaws and ice augers up trails, maintaining a 24-hour watch for 26 consecutive days, keeping fires burning across ice sheets and recutting breathing holes every 2 hours so oxygen reached the water. In another drainage, 3 families salvaged hundreds of fingerlings from a freezing creek, transferring them into insulated cedar tanks in heated workshops and hauling fresh water twice daily from a geothermal spring. Nearly 150 survived to be released back into the tributary come spring. When fisheries officers assessed the aftermath, they uncovered a clear pattern. Wherever residents intervened, winter kill was 3 times lower. The ministry shifted strategy, formalizing co-management agreements that designated community associations as custodians of surrounding headwaters, backed with funding, testing gear, and decision-making authority. During one planning session, an elder pointed out that 3 candidate tarns dried up completely every 7 or 8 years during droughts, a cycle he had witnessed twice. Biologists verified the hydrological data and struck those basins from the schedule, saving tens of thousands of fry. Local knowledge beat satellite surveys. Over the next 2 winters, mortality dropped by half, eventually stabilizing near 18%, a loss rate commercial hatcheries consider perfectly sustainable. With stability established, the narrative shifted toward unexpected social and environmental transformations. Residents realized a live trout swimming in an alpine lake was worth far more to the local hospitality economy than a dead fish at a market. Historical poaching, such as illegal gill netting and unpermitted night harvesting, almost entirely evaporated. This occurred not because of distant conservation officers, but because local outfitters and community members guarded the waterways themselves. One community association established a watershed code stricter than provincial regulations. Daily retention was capped at 2 fish. Fishing was prohibited during autumn spawning runs, and single barbless hooks were mandatory, enforced through community checkpoints. The second transformation arrived with telecommunications. Infrastructure programs erected cellular towers along highway corridors and mountain passes for backcountry eco-tourists who demanded coverage. For unincorporated settlements, high-speed connectivity transformed community dynamics. This proved most transformative for local women, who historically faced limited employment in forestry and mining. Home-cooked hospitality evolved into micro-enterprises. Using online booking platforms and mobile communications, residents catered meals and arranged lodging for wilderness guides. In one settlement, a resident preparing packed lunches for fly fishing parties expanded into a 6-room Alpine lodge within 3 seasons, employing 3 neighbors and out-earning her partner's former sawmill wages, prompting him to leave seasonal logging to manage lodge logistics full-time. A third outcome revitalized surrounding forests. Decades of clear-cutting right to watercourses had destabilized hillside soils, causing sediment runoff that clogged gravel beds. Because murky runoff repelled trout and prompted booking cancellations, local advisory councils informally halted commercial timber harvesting within a 300-meter riparian buffer around stocked lakes and tributaries. Although lacking formal legislative backing, community consensus held authority on the ground, shielding thousands of hectares of old-growth subalpine forest without government spending. The fourth transformation arrived from the sky. Wildlife researchers documented a noticeable spike in fish-eating raptors and waterfowl across the plateau. Belted kingfishers colonized creeks where prey was once scarce, and ospreys established active nests in valleys where they had not been recorded in 3 decades. As news spread, wildlife photographers and birdwatchers carrying telephoto lenses arrived, paying outfitter rates comparable to elite fly fishermen to document nesting raptors. What began as a narrow fish stocking trial had evolved into a self-sustaining ecotourism engine. Yet this ecological engineering soon exposed a serious downstream conflict. Salmonids are migratory, and as high-altitude populations grew, hundreds of thousands of juvenile trout drifted out of alpine cirques into major river systems where they had never existed. Anglers and commercial netting operations in lower basins suddenly found catches dominated by aggressive, fast-growing trout, pulling hundreds from stretches that had supported different aquatic communities for millennia. In these lower reaches, introduced trout competed directly with native cold-water species, including vulnerable populations of indigenous bull trout and white sturgeon, species holding profound cultural significance for First Nations and long-standing ecological importance. Indigenous fishers and river wardens observed native stocks thinning wherever predatory introduced trout established territories. The newcomer had become an apex competitor, displacing species protected for generations. An alliance of over 300 commercial fishers, hereditary leaders, and river stewardship groups petitioned the Environment Ministry, demanding emergency measures to contain migration and safeguard native species. The ministry formed an interagency working committee and launched a multi-year impact assessment. Field crews installed experimental fish exclusion screens along key outlet tributaries, permeable metal barriers designed to pass meltwater while preventing fish from descending into mainstem rivers. However, during spring freshets, swollen creeks carried massive loads of deadfall timber, gravel, and brush, clogging grates after every heavy rainstorm. The conflict between introduced game fish and native river ecology remains an unresolved dilemma and an undeniable cost requiring constant monitoring. Then, the subalpine climate delivered an unexpected stress test. An atmospheric river arrived in early autumn, dumping historic volumes of torrential rain on top of mountain snowpack. A flash flood tore down main valleys, causing rivers to rise 6 meters overnight, washing out bridges, cutting power grids, and isolating northern settlements for more than 3 weeks. When waters receded, biologists feared torrents had scoured alpine spawning beds and washed entire populations out of the high country. Yet monitoring data revealed the opposite. Trout populations remained resilient across nearly all headwaters and even increased in several tarns. Torrential wash had stripped organic forest debris and terrestrial nutrients off hillsides into the lakes, providing an unprecedented banquet of insects and micronutrients that sustained fish through the freeze. Down in dynamic river corridors, however, the flood triggered an evolutionary event no scientific board would ever sanction. Over 5 years of isolation, distinct populations had begun adapting to local environments. High-altitude lake trout grew compact, slow-growing, and cold-tolerant, while canyon riverfish became long, sleek, powerful swimmers built for heavy current. Floodwaters breached natural rock divides, sweeping these isolated strains into common pools and forcing them to interbreed on a massive scale. Whether this genetic mixing creates a biological dead end or produces an exceptionally resilient hybrid cold-water strain is a question researchers will track for decades. As the lead biologist observed, no regulatory body would have approved that genetic trial. But nature ran the experiment anyway. This brings us back to the central dilemma. Was introducing millions of sport fish into barren alpine watersheds visionary resource development or an expensive ecological mistake? The honest answer is that it was both. The project suffered undeniable planning oversights, poorly selected shallow lakes that froze solid, underestimated northern winter severity, and an invasive drift that continues to threaten native species downstream. Yet despite these complications, the initiative achieved what most government development programs never manage. It became entirely self-sustaining without ongoing public subsidies. Local communities took genuine ownership of the watersheds. Informal conservation corridors preserved thousands of hectares of old-growth riparian forest without legislative mandates, and a thriving, sustainable economy took root where the only raw inputs were cold alpine water and a tiny fingerling dot. The socioeconomic returns speak for themselves. Annual revenue generated from guided fly fishing charters, backcountry hospitality, and ecotourism quickly reached $7 million, recovering the initial 5-year capital cost of the program. Across participating northern districts, average household incomes rose by 62%. And for the first time in over 4 decades, regional census data recorded positive net migration into the territory, as young families chose to remain in their home valleys rather than moving away to industrial cities. A former seasonal forestry worker who once hauled basic gear up rocky trails now owns a successful backcountry outfitting business with a string of pack horses, earning more in 3 peak summer weeks than he previously earned during an entire year in a declining sawmill. 6 years ago, the highest alpine lake in this region held no fish whatsoever. Today, its waters sustain trophy trout averaging well over 2 kilograms. That remarkable turnaround represents the core reality of this story. When you provide a struggling rural community with a viable natural resource, the people living on that land will protect it with a degree of dedication and stewardship that no distant ministry office could ever replicate, building a thriving local economy far faster than anyone thought possible.